Okay, we're going to begin our study of the book of Kings and Chronicles. I'm going to call it Kings. I'm going to quit saying first and second. Just say Kings, okay? And Chronicles. And we're going to do something a little risky tonight. I'm going to show you a video. So if you can't see the screen from where you're sitting, you probably need to move forward. That's a no, okay? Well, your loss. Hopefully everyone got the email that I sent out. It had the 3 pages that are going to be the introduction to the lesson book when Craig finishes the lesson book. Hopefully you had got that, and some of the questions that I thought would be discussion questions for tonight. Craig talked about in his introduction how he's going to approach this class. So he mentioned in his introduction that he's going to do this in the form of a character study, not a verse-by-verse study. What exactly that means, I'm not sure. But obviously he's going to take each of the kings as the focus of each one of the lessons. And of course, some kings will require many more nights than others. Some will, I assume, will cover 2 or 3 at one sitting. So as you prepare for the class, you think about that. We're obviously going to start with Solomon, and of course that will take several class periods. And then we're going to follow the kings of Israel all the way through to the Assyrian captivity, and then come back and start over with the kings of Judah. I'm not really sure how the prophets will fit into that curriculum, but of course we will obviously have to talk about Elijah and Elisha in particular, and then the other prophets that are mentioned in the text. If you have one of the, let's see, I would suggest that you all get some kind of a table that shows the kings in order. Kings of Israel, kings of Judah, so that you can follow along, not only in the lessons, but in your mind. You can maybe jump back and forth, because as you know, it's extremely confusing. In some instances, there's a king of Judah, for instance, called Joram, and then shortly later, there's a king of Israel called Jehoram. And even in the text, sometimes Jehoram is referred to as Joram. And so it becomes extremely confusing. To me, it always has been. So it's important that we have some kind of, I think, a reference material that you can refer to, that you can reference, find where this particular king is found in his particular dynasty, what prophets might relate to him, and usually you'll find also an evaluation as good or bad. Something like that would be extremely helpful.
Hey, Thomas?
Danny.
When did you send that email? When did you send it?
I forget. Monday? Who got it? Okay, good. Thank you. There is There is a website that I have found extremely helpful in my biblical studies as a reference. It's called the Bible Project. This is one of their productions. Think you could learn anything from that? This is called an overview of the book of Kings. I printed mine off so I could look at it every now and then, and it helps me. But more importantly, how we get to there is what I want to do tonight. The video that shows us how we get here. And this is a visual representation of the book of Kings. So we're going to try a video. I don't know how it's going to work. About 8 minutes. Whoop. Are we there, Austin?
Yeah.
Nope. Can you hit play? There we go.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focused on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here because David and Solomon then go on to conspire. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story. They go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. And the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
So let's talk about a little bit about what he said, some of the more traditional things, but with the perspectives as we look at this book, and we talk about who wrote it, when it was written, the perspective it was written from is the most important thing I think that we can think about, maybe not come to a conclusion, but think about. Why did God write this book? And what was he telling his intended hearers? So, let's think about that. Who wrote the book? Jewish tradition tells us that Jeremiah wrote it. But most biblical scholars would say that that doesn't make a lot of sense. Jeremiah, you remember, ended up in Egypt, was carried away to Egypt and died in Egypt. And so some of the perspective of this book doesn't fit that locality or that perspective of the prophet Jeremiah, who was looked down upon by all of the Jews of that day and was carried away into Egypt. So let's think about possibly other possibilities. The writer in the book mentions he had or references some other writings. He mentions the book of the Acts of Solomon, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, which indicates to me that this writer had some access to court annals, who was somebody of at least of some status, who had the ability to reference these materials. Not only could, but had access to them. Who would that have been? If he was writing after the exile, after the carrying away to Babylon, who would have had access to those writings? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it strikes me that one possible good candidate would be Daniel. Daniel, who was in a position of prominence in the kingdom of the Medo-Persians, who wrote the book of Daniel and all the prophecy that was encompassed or involved in that. Maybe he would have had the access that would have allowed him to write this book. But it's not just an historical book. What do you think? What do you see in what you have read previously in the book of Kings that might lead you to an understanding of why it was written and who it was written to? Any thoughts? Monty.
The kings, obviously, in Israel, they were all bad. And so just leadership from men teaches failure. But God's kingdom is different. I think that's one message to get from it, is that if you're going to rely on these leaders of men, you're destined for failure.
Okay. Now, who would that have been significant to? Would that have been significant to maybe people involved in the restoration of Israel? All the way down towards the end of the exile, towards Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, would it have been significant for them to know the history of Israel and the mistakes that they made? Maybe so. Maybe that gives us some indication. The book has some slants, some perspectives that are interesting. It talks about, obviously, the covenant. Let's read a couple of verses. I don't want to read all of them, but over in Deuteronomy, you remember where Moses gave them, reinstituted the covenant with the new generation. Within that context, he talks about the king that they're going to have, which was against God's will, but he told them in chapter 17, verse 14, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me, and you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your own countrymen. Jump down to verse 18. Now it shall come about, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll, and in the presence of the Levitical priests it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes. Up front, God said, you're going to set a king over you. I know you are. When you do, you make sure that it is a king who's going to know my law, one who has read it, who reads it every day. Obviously, the book of First Kings and Chronicles highlights the fact that there were kings who did not fit that covenant relationship. It talks about them over and over, drawing an evaluation of them. One, how they compared to their father David, or even there are a couple of instances in the instance of Jehoshaphat and Josiah. It says there was no king like him after him or even before him. They were even better than David was. So, in the writing of the book, the writer is evaluating each king in the basis of his covenant obedience and drawing some stark conclusions about why you are now sitting in exile. Over in chapter 17 of 2 Kings, if I can find it, maybe that's not the right. Yeah, chapter 17. Beginning in verse 13. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you through my servants the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he made with their fathers, and his warnings with which he warned them. They followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord had commanded them not to do like them. They forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of the heavens, and served Baal. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire, and practiced divination, enchantments, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. So the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them from his sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. The writer here reiterates to his readers, this is what happened, and this is why it happened. And this is why you're now sitting wherever they were sitting, in Babylon, and you have no excuses. That's the reason. Now, maybe he's writing to one generation removed, and these people are going, I thought we had a covenant with God. What happened? Kings and Chronicles explains that to them. Okay? Anybody got any comments? Also, the Davidic Covenant. You remember the promises made to David that a descendant of his would sit on the throne forever. The questions that would have come to the minds of those people who knew that covenant now as they were sitting in exile. What has happened? There is no king. The promise God made us apparently was not true. And the writer of Kings tells them again why he had taken them away. Let's go over to, where is it? Over in chapter 21. Verse 10, now the Lord spoke, now the first reading I read you was about Israel. This is about Judah, in an explanation of why Judah was carried away. Now the Lord spoke through his servant the prophet, saying, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has done these abominations, having done more wickedly than all the Amorites who were before him, and has also made Judah sin with his idols. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity on Jerusalem and Judah that whoever hears of it, both his ears will tingle. Even though Josiah was the son of Manasseh and instituted all those reforms and was, by some estimation, the best king Judah ever had, God said in chapter 23, verse 25, before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. However, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath with which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. The Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off Jerusalem, this city which I have chosen, and the temple of which I said, my name shall be there. So, in terms of who he's writing to, the explanations of what had happened historically that got his readers to the point that they are currently wondering about, weren't we the favored nation? Didn't God have a covenant with us? Didn't he say that the descendant of David will be on the throne? Book of Kings answers those questions. Our video mentioned the last couple of verses of 2 Kings. It's an interesting addendum to the exile. Verse 27, now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, released Joachim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion for each day, all the days of his life. Surely a reference to, you wonder where the Davidic covenant went? There it is. Jehoiachin, the last descendant of David, the last king, and he is not dead. He is at the table with the king of Babylon, surely hearkening to a time when the Davidic lineage will be reinstituted. Any thoughts, comments? No? Okay. So, the perspective of the book, a retrospective recounting of Israel's history from a perspective of how each king measures up to David and how he kept the covenant and therefore how he is responsive to the covenant, and therefore the nation. The book of Kings obviously is not just a historical book. There are some examples of some prominent kings historically who were given short shrift in the scriptures. One example is Omri. Omri was you remember the story of Omri? Anybody remember the story of Omri, how he became king? There was a king of the northern tribes called Elah, and he was killed by a man named Zimri, who was a commander in the army. And Zimri took the throne and reigned for 6 days, I believe it was. 6 or 7 days, one or the other. And the people, the military said, no, you're not going to be our king. And so 2 commanders from the military took him out. Now, I think he killed himself, but said, no, you're not going to be king. And so Zimri, I think, burned the palace down on his head. Those 2 kings were Tibni and Omri. And for the next 4 years, they contended with each other as to who would be king. Omri ultimately rose to the position of king, and he served for I don't know how many years. But the point is that he served for 12 years. He was politically, economically, one of the best kings the northern nation of Israel had. He pushed the borders of Israel north all the way to Damascus in Syria. He subjugated the kingdom of Moab, which was across the Jordan and north of the Transjordan area. We read about some of these things in the historical records of the Assyrian Chronicles and on the Moabite stone that was found. He also was the one who selected the hill of Samaria and built a fortress citadel on top of that hill, which became the capital of the northern tribes until the Assyrian conquest. His son, Ahab, married the daughter of the Sidonian king, her name Jezebel, obviously, but he formed an alliance with Tyre and Sidon and cemented that alliance by having his son marry their daughter. All of those things politically, economically were very significant to the northern kingdom, and yet in the scriptures, God deals with his reign in 6 verses. The point being that the emphasis that that God puts in 1 Kings is not a political, not an economic emphasis. It is an emphasis on who follows the covenant, who benefits the nation spiritually. And so Omri's one example. Can you think of any other examples, either positively or negatively? Examples of kings who were emphasized in the account. Who were some of the kings that we know a lot about because God wrote a lot about them? Ahab? Yeah. Got any commentary on that? Jeroboam? The first one or the second one?
First one, although the second one, he probably helped the Israelites to promote economically, maybe behind economically, the northern kingdom under Jeroboam second was quite tremendous apparently. That's part of the reason for the prophecy in the northern kingdom.
So Stuart's he mentioned Ahab. Obviously, Ahab was involved in the Baal worship that Jezebel brought with her, and he apparently let her influence him greatly, and the conflict that arose between him and Jezebel and Elijah, culminating in that famous story on Mount Carmel. Chapter after chapter of that section of history, because it was so significant in the falling away of the northern tribes. Stuart mentioned Jeroboam, who was the first Jeroboam who split, who even God said he would it would be with him if he would be obedient to him, and then he set up the golden calves. There's a lot about Jeroboam, the first one, very little about the second Jeroboam, Jeroboam the second, as Stuart mentioned. Jeroboam, the second Jeroboam, was very significant in, again, establishing, promoting Israel in a political way. He expanded the borders. I think it says almost to where Solomon had the borders. And yet Jeroboam, a bad king, was given very little emphasis in the books. Manasseh would be another one. Manasseh was emphasized, and we read, Manasseh was not, it seems to me, was the tipping point for God with the nation of Judah. I don't know what it was. What was it that God found so abhorrent about the reign of Manasseh? Was it the burning of children? Was that it? I don't know. But there's certainly an emphasis there. Some of the good kings that are emphasized. Obviously, Hezekiah. Those two kings I mentioned before in the account that are listed as there was no king like him, either before him or after him. Hezekiah and Josiah are those two examples. Hezekiah did away with all the high places, which most of the kings, even the good kings, did not do that. But Hezekiah did away with all the high places. Did away with the Asherah. You remember he burned or did away with that bronze serpent that had somehow survived all the way from the Exodus, and people were now burning incense to it, had made an idol out of it. He did away with that. Did he grind it up, I think? I don't remember exactly. But he did away with that Nehushtan idol. He was a leader in Jerusalem when the Assyrians carried away the northern kingdom, and then they came south, and they literally took the whole country except the city of Jerusalem. They came right up to the gates, and Hezekiah, you remember the story, lamented the fact that Jerusalem was going to fall, and Isaiah comes and tells him, you need to buck up, that God is more powerful than the Assyrians, and the story of 180,000 Assyrians being killed in one night. All of that, Hezekiah's reign and his faithfulness in doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. And then also Josiah. So, the emphasis being not one of political or economic value, but being one of spiritual value throughout the book. As we do the character studies of each of these individual kings, it's important for us to understand why some are emphasized and some are not. Any thoughts, comments?
I think one of the things that's really interesting about Hezekiah is in verse 5, talks about Hezekiah trusted in the Lord God of Israel. Not one of the kings of Judah was like him either before him or after him. And that includes Josiah. In the trusting of the Lord. And I find that interesting.
So as we do character studies, it's interesting to read those types of evaluations and try to understand what it is that gets that kind of high praise from God. Any other thoughts? None? That clock is not right, is it? A little bit behind. So, what's the theme of perspective of the book of Chronicles? We've talked about 1 Kings. What about Chronicles? You know, every time we've studied through the Old Testament that I can remember, we've always studied 1st and 2nd Kings and then just used 1st and 2nd Chronicles as a supplement for additional information. Why is that, do you think?
You get all the details in Kings, all the bad details, basically. And it seems like Chronicles does more of a, you hear nicer things in Chronicles about what happened with the different kings.
So that's one point.
Different perspective.
Chronicles, the perspective of the first off, Chronicles only deals with the southern kingdom. The only time it mentions a northern king is when the northern king has some interaction with the southern kingdom, either an alliance or they're fighting each other. That's the only time he mentions a northern king. But the writer sticks with the southern kingdom exclusively, and he deals particularly with David and Solomon in a very favorable light. He talks, where am I here? In the instance of David, nothing is mentioned of David's sin with Bathsheba, with the Amnon's rape of Tamar, or any of the family problems that David had. David is set on a pedestal and looked at as the epitome that all kings should aspire to. Solomon, likewise, is set in that light. And none of the problems that Solomon had are mentioned in the book of Chronicles. There's some other unique things about Chronicles. One is it has several genealogies to start off the book. It starts with the genealogy of Adam. It talks about the genealogy of Abraham, of David, and then it goes through all of the 12 sons of Judah, but not in order. It starts with Judah, then Simeon, and then it does Reuben, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh, and then it does Levi, and then it does the rest of the tribe, Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, and Naphtali. What do you see in that order that gives you some indication of the perspective of the book? Do you see anything in there?
Well, perhaps a vision of Christ, ultimately Christ the first man, if you will, Adam being the first created. Judah, Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, leading off with that, and I guess just ultimately the kingship of God being the right way to go.
Okay, good. I didn't talk about it, but Jewish tradition again says the writer of the book of Chronicles is Ezra. So where does that put the perspective in terms of time and intent or persuasion, trying to persuade? If Ezra was the writer, what's happening what's contemporary historically with Ezra?
So the rebuilding of the temple and the city walls of Jerusalem, so reestablishing the kingdom, if you will.
So the restoration of the kingdom would overshadow what Ezra is writing here. So as he writes about people going back to the land, genealogies would be very significant, wouldn't they? Who's going to be the priest? Who's qualified to be the priest? Well, you'd need a genealogy of Levi, wouldn't you? You'd need if you were going to determine, okay, we're moving back to the land, where are we going to live? Well, you, Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh, you were given the land over on the other side of the Jordan. So everyone would have to establish a family identity to determine where their heritage had been. And did they follow that? I don't know. I'm sure the northern tribes were full of people that Assyria had moved in to that region, and so could whatever Issacharites were left, would they go back to the land of Issachar and just take up residence? I don't know. But the genealogies would have been important in that particular purpose. Okay? And an answer to the question of not just why are we here in terms of the Book of Kings being in, the writer of the Book of Kings being in exile and trying to answer the questions of why we're here. The writer of the Book of Chronicles seems to be answering the question where we need to be. We need to go back. And there's huge emphasis in the Book of Chronicles on the construction of the temple, when Solomon built the temple. Why would that be important to those people going back? Well, one of the purposes is to build the temple, right? So even some of the details in the construction is there in the Book of Chronicles. Perspective. The book, to me, seems to be written from a perspective of restoration. Is God still with us? Are the covenants still in force? Now that we have no king and are subject to the Persians, what is our heritage? Where should we be in terms of who's our leader? What is the significance of a rebuilt temple? Some of these people had never seen the temple. You remember when they built it? Just the old people remembered what the first ones looked like, and they wept because of the comparison. So they didn't even know what the temple was for. So, writing of the Book of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, directly addressing those things. Anybody have any comments about the book? Kings or Chronicles?
I was looking at the Bible dictionary a minute ago, and it said that Ezra was probably the one who composed Kings.
Really?
From the writings of David and Solomon and some other, maybe 3 or 4 other people.
Okay.
But might make some sense, and then he followed it up with Chronicles to add some detail, just a thought.
Certainly, good guess is mine. Anybody else? Okay, next week we will start with Solomon, of course. So I just suggest you read it. I think it's first 12 chapters of First Kings deals with the reign of Solomon. So we'll talk about that next week. I'll send out some questions to kind of specifically highlight where I will be going with my thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Good evening. It's good to see everyone out tonight. Our song that we'll sing here in just a moment is number 424, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. If I can maintain my composure. A guy that I used to visit, his name was Brad Wilkinson. He was in the Marines, and he had an accident and was in the nursing home in St. Louis. And we would go and sing songs with him, and this was one of the songs that he really liked. So let's sing. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Safe and secure from all harms. Lean on Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how sweet to walk in this pilgrim way, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. Safe and secure from all harms. Leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. Safe and secure from all harms. Lean on Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms.
It's good to see everyone here tonight. Thank you for coming out. Our numbers are a little bit short tonight. We've got some people missing, it looks like. I want to follow up on some of the announcements from Sunday. Kitty's niece, Gloria, went to her doctor's appointment, her eye doctor's appointment, and she received a good report. They think that her eye is going to heal on its own, so that's good news. I asked you to continue to pray for Mary. She's recovering from cracked and broken ribs. Continue to pray for Christy and her dad, Alvis. Alvis's surgery did go well. He was expected to be in the hospital, I think, for 5 days afterwards, after his surgery. Continue to pray for baby Thatcher. I understand that they're treating him for an infection right now. Please include me in your prayers. Monty did find out that John Helbing did pass away on Sunday. So I ask you to please continue to pray for his family and his friends for comfort and for peace of mind. Craig and Shirley are in Arizona. They left today, I believe, and they're going to be gone through next Wednesday. Diana's going to be leaving tomorrow, going down to Texas, and she'll be returning on Monday. We've got the gospel meet coming up in a week and a half, starts on the 22nd. The sign-up sheet for the meals for Andy has been filled up. That's good. We still need men to volunteer toward the prayers during the gospel meet. If you're available to say, men, if you're available to say a prayer on Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday, Friday, the gospel meet, please let one of the elders know so that we can schedule the prayers. Anything else we need to mention tonight? Okay, we'll be closed with a prayer.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you now, thankful for this time that we had to come together again as a congregation and learn more about you. Lord, please be with us as we go throughout our lives. Help us to be shining lights for you and always be bold in our faith. Lord, please be with those who are away right now and traveling. Please keep them safe and give them a safe travel wherever they're going. Lord, please watch over us. Help us to always be the Christians that we are taught to be. Please be with us as we travel on our way. Help us to be safe in those travels. It's your Son's name that I pray. Amen.